My name is Dr. Miles Taylor. I am the director of the Pepper Institute on Aging and Public Policy, and it is such a pleasure for me to welcome our fall speaker, Dr. Kelley. I should note that today's presentation is co-sponsored with the Institute of Successful Longevity at FSU, and I'm so thrilled because this partnership means that we can bring a broader range of innovative and interdisciplinary work to our campus. Before I introduce Dr. Kelley officially, I just wanted to mention that I've known her for quite some time, and we have a few areas of research interest that overlap, but I think more than that, it has been so exciting and exhilarating to see the innovative ways and directions that her work has taken her over the years. So that's my quick introduction, but I'll give you her more formal bio. Dr. Kelley studies the causes and consequences of health disparities over the life course, particularly those related to race, socioeconomic status, and disability. She has expertise in quantitative analyses of longitudinal and panel data, including latent trajectories and multi-level modeling. Her recent research is focused on life course influences on later life functional disparities among Black and white adults, how cohort trends and social change affect later life health profiles, social influences on the experience of disability, and neighborhoods and social exclusion of older adults. Dr. Kelley currently serves as editor-in-chief for Journal of Gerontology Social Sciences. She is series co-editor of the annual review of Gerontology and Geriatrics. She serves on a number of editorial boards of some of the top journals in our area, and she currently serves on the advisory board for the Research Center of the Minority Research at ICPSR. She's also recently completed terms as chair of the section on aging and life course of the American Sociological Association and member at large for the Behavioral and Social Sciences section of the Gerontological Society of America. So in sum, if you have not already come across Dr. Kelley, I'm sure you will at some point because she is such a leader in our field. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kelley. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Dr. Taylor, for that wonderful introduction. That was beautiful. And thank you all for inviting me to come. I'm sorry I can't do it in person. I love the synergy of getting to spend time with people and hearing about their work. So when we're finally all back in person in conferences, don't be a stranger. Come on up and let's have those chats to keep this going. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my presentation with you now. And so somebody can shout at me if you can't see that. I decided today to talk about what I called structures and systems, the life course scaffolding of later life health and well-being. And it's rather than sort of presenting sort of a single study all the way through, I actually am pulling from 2 or 3 different other streams, things that I've been writing on in the last several years and currently writing, some new fresh ideas that I think have hit the field, and just sort of synergizing where I think maybe new frontiers and new opportunities for us in the study of aging and life course is headed. So with that, I'll tell you that the other impetus for this talk was really a headline that I came across in Wired magazine. And for those of you in this area, longevity will be the new inequality is not a shock to anyone. We've known about life expectancy. We've known about all sorts of these dynamics for many years. But what struck me was that the article itself was really sort of a technology article. And it was saying that we should do away with chronological age, that it was pointless, that we should instead mark everything in society by biological age, and that we should, and that there's no point in having mandatory retirement, because if you're still thinking like a 40-year-old, you should not be forced out of work, and so on. And so as I really got to, sort of chewing on the article a little bit and the idea of why they're calling it the new inequality, I was sort of struck by the irony that people with younger biological age than their chronological age have already been the products of advantage and privilege, that they have in fact had safe environments to grow up and grow old in, and been able to manage stress and high control of their lives and nutrition. And so what we're essentially proposing is that those who have been the products of all this great advantage now have lower biological age, so we should give them more resources too. So it becomes then sort of a reward for more advantage. And a lot of my work is grounded in cumulative disadvantage theory, so this seemed to just resonate in terms of those who have still continue to get more. And sort of generally, when we think about sort of age and inequality, our field has really grown in the last several decades, really of sort of bringing inequality more centrally into the study of age and aging and life course. And that's and cumulative disadvantage and those processes and those frameworks have really helped to centralize that in mainstream gerontology and aging research. In fact, you could walk into almost any program studying aging or gerontology, and a first-year student can tell you that inequality is going to increase with age, advantages beget advantages, disadvantages beget disadvantages as we go. And so this is somewhat axiomatic in the way we think about things. And, and as we think about sort of why it is that those happen, we focus on the idea that these are socially produced, but also then temporally ordered because the life course is organized in institutions and stages. So we're moving in and out and through these institutions in similar sort of patterns. And so they're influencing our advantages for the next time and for the next time through these institutions over time. And none of that is too terribly surprising. But when I see a lot of papers when they're writing and they talk about cumulative disadvantage theory, they're really very often emphasizing the differentiation processes. So they're very interested in what makes people different. And so they're looking at that inter-individual divergence, and they're looking to see how do groups diverge with time, and or do they stay roughly similar with time, and so on, as ways of sort of thinking about it. But I would actually press us to take that same definition and concentrate on that first part of the definition, which is the systemic tendency for this inter-individual divergence, and sort of bringing a little more centrally the idea of the systems that created these advantages and disadvantages, not so much just the divergent processes as they play out in health and aging over time. And when I say systemic, I really mean sort of accumulative processes that are inherent in our social systems at all levels of organization, from macro, meso, micro, so that they're mutually reinforcing, they're complementary, they're in many ways sort of interactive with each other that sort of perpetuate the system itself. So systems, while they can be changed, tend to be somewhat obdurate. Systems tend to like being exactly as they are. So in many ways, we have to have all these levels sort of cooperating to sort of keep those things in place. And this isn't really sort of my ideas. This has been, these have been around in cumulative disadvantage in particular for a while, to the point that DePreet and Eyrich make the important point, that these systems are so determinative of accumulative processes that one's given social position in the system becomes its own resource in itself. And probably the best example I can think of here is something like white privilege, that people are placed into a system in relatively advantaged positions, which beget more advantages, so that their own early advantaged position end up being a resource in itself that not everyone else sort of has. And that sort of brings us to so this is sort of the broader ideas that we're sort of thinking about here. And as we do, I want to sort of take this idea of systems, and I want to sort of play with it across sort of four sort of key areas today, and to do each of these briefly, but also in the process of doing this, also highlight sort of cutting edge new work that's come out. So new ideas that are fresh are being infused in these. And the first one I want to sort of introduce with this, it has to do with structural inequality. And the idea that the inequality itself is infused into systems rather than systems sort of being these sort of, benign, sort of structures through which we interact, but that the inequality itself is sort of baked into those systems as we go. And as we think about that, I think about Matthew Rigney's arguments in the Matthew effect. And he talks about that inequalities, once they come into existence, become self-perpetuating and self-amplifying, that and that, in the absence of intervention, we're going to see that widening gap. So in other words, without explicit decision to change the system, the inequality will itself grow and continue in its own way. And Gunnar Myrdal, who was writing in the 1940s, and he wrote, An American Dilemma about the race problem in the United States, he sort of gives this sort of anti-Parsonian argument, right? Where he says that there's no such tendency toward automatic self-stabilization in the system. In other words, we can't trust the system to rebalance itself, right? To swing the pendulum back, to return to equality. And in fact, once it's been pushed, as he says, in a particular direction, the tendency of the system is to continue in that direction, but actually go much further and much faster, so that the inequality, he calls it circular causation, will be accumulative and will often sort of gather at that accelerating speed. So again, sort of systems themselves move toward inequality sort of as part of their sort of natural operating, and they need sort of further intervention to sort of break off. And the reason I sort of raise these is because, as you well know, there has been a major push in science and in the discourse to really start talking about structural racism, right? And this idea of how in the world we sort of integrate this into our science to fully understand it, to apprehend it, to bring it from the invisible into the visible in how we do our inquiry. And I will say that when I say structure, I'm using structural racism as the example today. Structural sexism, any kind of structural inequalities are going to follow this same kind of logic. And I know Professor Homan is there and can give you a long thesis on structural sexism. And if you haven't read her AJS paper, go do that right now. Well, finish my talk and then go and read her paper, because it's really wonderful. But I won't embarrass her or me by trying to do that here. But I will sort of highlight a recent paper with Guy and Hinken that was in Ethnicity and Disease. It was part of a special issue on structural racism. And they use the analogy of the Buckminster fullerene. And I don't know if you remember your chemistry, but this is a very unique carbon molecule that is put together in such a structurally sound way that it almost can't be destroyed. And if you notice, it has a similar shape. There's the pentagons and the hexagrams. You can actually see that it's basically a soccer ball. So you can sort of think of it as sort of what you might visualize a soccer ball sort of looking like. But the molecules itself are fascinating to chemists because they have what they call exceptional tensile strength. It won't be crushed or moved. And if you bump it in one way, it's going to immediately bounce back to its shape. That it has no motivation to move from what it's got already. And it's also got efficient electrical and heat conduction. So at any point you put stress or tension or energy, it's just going to diffuse that throughout the whole molecule as a way of protecting its own integrity. So if you think of structural racism or any structural inequality as being like this Buckminster fullerene, right? We can think of it as being this sort of system of public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, other norms that are operating, again, at all of these levels of social organization for the sake of reinforcing the ways that we can perpetuate group inequity. And it's also sort of an interesting idea because it's round in structure. And I don't know about you, but I often think in hierarchies, and I think of ladders and hierarchies, but to think of it as sort of being a round system really sort of means that it's sort of either surrounding us, that we're in it, we're all sort of operating in and around and through these connected pieces, whether they be institutional all the way down to micro norms and interactions in how we're operating. So the imagination that we could bring as life course scholars to these ideas, right, is to integrate more fully, more centrally into the motivation for our analysis is thinking about structural racism and how this is going to create these cumulative processes over time. And we see it a lot. I see it a lot in papers in the discussion section, sort of attributing things to structural racism, but maybe finding ways we can sort of more centralize it into the inquiry itself. And I'm not going to go into too much data on that, but I want to just highlight a couple recent some recent research that has shown how these systems of structural racism have exceptional tensile strength, if we think of it, right? That following the 1968 Fair Housing Act, when we made it illegal for redlining and for racial residential segregation, that the system itself, so we put pressure, we removed one element of that segregation and that racism, only to have it filled immediately as a system by the banks and the real estate industry, who colluded to continue and perpetuate these practices through other avenues for the same goal and the same intent, which was racial residential segregation. And a brand new book that just came out, it's very interesting, on state and community sanctioned practices that allow white communities and white neighborhoods to hoard the community resources to the point of deprivation in communities and neighborhoods of color. So it's really this idea of, you know, who has been allowed to hoard and all of the advantage and in our neighborhoods and in our communities. And then of course, but the tax system itself, this is a very nice book if you really love taxes, but really sort of how they're sort of built for, we're really sort of built the tax system around white people and white homeowners in particular, to the point that dollar for dollar, non-white families pay more in taxes than white families do. And so how have we built this system that just perpetuates these kinds of inequalities at all levels? And how do we sort of center that back into our inquiry about what this might mean for intergenerational wealth transfer, you know, health gaps, wealth gaps, you know, quality schooling, which sets, which you know, sort of sets children on certain educational paths and opportunities. So how can we center that when we're thinking about these accumulative processes that occur over the life course and across generations? The second thing I want to sort of mention here is actually the cohort-centric life course. And early on in aging research, you know, much was made out of cohorts. And this was really sort of the early part of how we, you know, learned and came up, you know, and we understood a lot of what happened with cohort. But really in probably the last 10, 15 years, you know, there's really been this sort of shift to thinking about sort of a lot more on aging processes and age and what's happening at different ages and how aging works. And so, which is fine, the work's been wonderful, but you know, but we have too little work, I think, in my humble opinion, that is putting cohort back into the inquiry itself. And we really could expand this, given so many of the current events that are happening and so many of the things that are going on. And I want to highlight a brand new paper. In fact, it's so new, it's pre-publication on the JGS website, and that's by Zoetti and Crystal. And what they did is something I think is highly innovative and shows us what we could do with certain kinds of things. And one of them is that they take the 2008, the 2008 financial crisis, and they follow 4 cohorts over time. And so their question is, what happens when you take a major historical macro level economic event that affected everybody, affected the whole system? And what happens if you interlay that onto the cohorts to understand where they are in their own cumulative disadvantage processes as they age? And is there a difference in how inequality gets accumulated depending on the age of the cohort when they get hit by these external crises? And so they're really sort of blending together a period effect and CDA at the same time to ask this question. And this is the figure that's from their table. Trust me, I got their permission. So this is not nothing's wrong here. But anyway, so this is they have the 4 panels of the cohorts: war babies, boomers, Generation X, and millennials. And as you can see, they have time across the bottom. 07 was right before the crisis, and then they followed through 16. And I won't get into all the details of their paper, although I think it's an excellent discourse on this topic. But quickly, just to point out that following the 2008 crisis, wealth inequality actually grew in the 2 working age cohorts, Gen Xers and baby boomers. And that in fact, following the 2008 crisis, wealth inequality actually shrank slightly among millennials. So the key innovation of what they're sort of thinking about, and these next figures are mine, not theirs, is this question of millennials who didn't have that much differentiation at the beginning. They were sort of at the beginning, they were still in their training period, they were early careers, they hadn't accrued a lot of assets, that there really wasn't a whole lot to lose or gain. Therefore, the CDA, the cumulative disadvantage and advantage mechanism, the machine wasn't really turned on because nobody really had much of anything. So the inequality itself doesn't really go anywhere following the '08 crisis. But we find that with Gen X, they're working. If they're going to buy a home, many of them have already done so. They're starting to save for retirement. They probably paid off their student loans at this time. So they're starting to gain assets, and we're starting to see that differentiation naturally between those who are sort of getting ahead economically and those who are sort of falling behind or staying stable. And what we find is that inequality grows after the '08 crisis because the Gen Xers who had assets, things like 401ks, could capitalize on the post-crisis growth, right? The stock market went way up. And so if you had assets, you got more assets at the end of it than you did before. But if you never had much, you didn't really go anywhere. And in fact, you may have even gotten worse. And this is actually even greater for the baby boomers because they had more to lose and more to gain. So we actually saw that of all four cohorts, inequality grew most among baby boomers. And 8 years after the crisis, the top 10% of baby boomers held 50% of their cohort's wealth. So it was an extreme amount of shifting of the wealth following the crisis. And interestingly, the war babies don't really do anything. They sort of just hang out there, and part of the, what Zoetti and Crystal hypothesized, which is really that whatever was going to happen in cumulative disadvantage kinds of ways has already happened. It's played out. They're kind of, they may be in sort of more fixed retirement, incomes, whatever it is, it's, the show's over. So it's really a matter of seeing which cohort intersects at which time to understand how inequality is going to play for each of them in their own cumulative disadvantage contexts. And I'll give a second brief example. This is work that I presented in the Handbook of Aging and Social Sciences recently, and that had to do with sort of cohort differences and age effects of obesity and metabolic conditions. And so just briefly, just the timeline there on the right. One of the things that sort of happened, as you notice, the red line, which is the US obesity, is really sort of relatively flat and then sort of shoots right up. And you see it's headed up with the high fructose corn syrup and the television ads and all of these sorts of things are sort of also going on at this time. And what's very important is this is another one of, just like the economic crisis of '08, there was a major shift, a major policy shift in food in the United States in the early 1970s. In the US Farm Bill, the middle-class families were feeling, the meat prices were going up and they were feeling the pinch, and politicians wanted to please their constituents. So they radically rewrote the US agriculture policy to heavily double and triple down on subsidies for corn and wheat and soybeans and rice. And I could go on because I'm a little bit of a junkie on farm bills, but there are a lot of other things that happened, but just to keep those pieces in mind, right? That we flooded the system with all of these commodity crops. And yes, meat went down because it was cheaper to feed animals, but also what were we going to do with all this extra stuff? Well, then we just start the birth of the snack food industry, right? Let's put them in chips and crackers and cookies and all these things. So it was really interesting, if you follow a nutritional epidemiologist, everyone of all ages in this period from 1970s to the mid 1980s saw significant rises in calorie intake. Everybody increased their calories at all ages, older adults, younger adults, children. But if your cohort was already, if you were already an older adult when all of this hit, you'd spent most of your life with a whole different kind of diet. So your accumulation of metabolic conditions was going to be very different from if you were born into this era and were moving forward. So understanding when the cohorts hit this major transition to what we call the sort of the Western diet was really going to matter. And with that, the linkage, when it was first sort of a secular increase in everyone's calorie intake, but then by the mid 2000s, it was very clear that there was this association that obesity became concentrated in lower income strata, and so that we now have sort of an obesity social class privilege issue that's also sort of mapping on to our obesity inquiry. So were we just to look at, does obesity cause diabetes? Does diabetes cause functional limitations? And we were to look at these causal models and we were only look at aging, we would not be accounting for the fact that these cohorts hit this interesting time at a very different sort of pace. And to just briefly illustrate that, put a fine point on that, in our chapter, one of the things that we did is we went back and we calculated the rejection rate in World War I. So these would be soldiers who were drafted 1914, 1918-ish, and so it was a draft. So you could think of it as sort of like a random sample of young men in the United States, and the rejection rate for undernutrition, meaning they were so malnourished they didn't even develop musculature correctly, was about 3.5%. And the rejection rate for being too overweight or obese was 0.01%. Today, fast forward about 100 years later, the rejection rate for obesity for otherwise qualified military recruits is now at 25%. 1 in 4 otherwise qualified cannot join the military because of obesity. So we're seeing these sort of young adults radically in a period of a year make, in 100 years, make radical shifts in calorie intake and obesity and structural conditions. What does it mean to be young and that obese, and what does this mean for long-term public health in future cohorts? So paying attention to sort of those ideas of how is this going to play out in future cohorts as we go. And just to emphasize again that because this is now, obesity is becoming so, particularly childhood and youth obesity is becoming very concentrated in the lower economic strata, we're seeing obesity being both a product and a driver of privilege, that it becomes stigmatizing, that it becomes limiting, that it becomes its own disadvantage process all on its own. So thinking about how these are going to play with us as we sort of move forward through our research, our current older adults versus our future older adults. The third dimension that I'd like to mention is actually comparisons across societal contexts. And comparative work has been around for ages. People have been doing it for lots of for work, and we know a lot. So this is not that no one has done these kinds of things. But in fact, we've documented differences in health across societies and all sorts of societal contexts, and we know quite a bit about life expectancies and functional limitations and mental health and disease prevalence and all of these sorts of things. But interestingly, critics of this field argue that this literature tends to stop the analysis at the stage of finding differences, so that they're sort of like, well, I found a difference, therefore I'm done. And there's much less work that's searching for the mechanisms. And so you can often find papers that find differences, and then you get to their discussion section, and there's all this hand waving, like it's probably the welfare state regimes, it's probably what's going on, And so it's this idea that we didn't really, that we don't really test those mechanisms. We just sort of like generically attribute societal differences to it. And we really need to get into that work and dig further, deeper into that work as we go. And I'll mention one paper here in the next slide that I think is sort of pointing us to the kinds of things we can think about. I do want to also mention that Haas and Oy did a really excellent paper looking at childhood conditions on later life health across 13 countries. Well done paper. And it was Europe, England, and Ireland. And ultimately, in the end, they found very few differences between countries. If you were poor, you had poor health. If you were better off, you had better health. It didn't really matter which country context that you were in. There was very little variation. And they make in their discussion what I think is a really interesting point that has stuck with me. And that's that when we're deciding who we're going to compare, we need to make sure that we aren't comparing societies who are so similar that we end up falsely concluding that all aging processes are generic, right? Is that they're all fine, that maybe it's false comparisons if the contexts are too alike. And that was part of why they thought they weren't finding what they did. But I think that immediately screams for us to start using the data that's becoming available and will be available soon of Latin America, the global South, South Asia, East Asia, Africa. Like, we've got these big panel studies out there, more is coming, that let's think more creatively outside of the US European bubble, and let's start really, interrogating these other societal contexts, which could sort of open brand new doors for the way we're even thinking about aging. And to that point, and I'll just mention this very briefly about this study that Avila et al. Did in their JGSS, I think it was the April issue. And their question was really about comparing the US and Mexico. And they wanted to ask a straightforward sort of biological question, right? What is the impact of diabetes on cognition? And is that biological impact universal across wildly different societal contexts? And in the Mexican context, for example, they have much less sort of infrastructure built for diabetes and chronic disease management, lower education and lifetime socioeconomic status, competing across the life, competing chronic and infectious diseases as they sort of build in their healthcare structure, whereas the US has a more privileged environment in terms of having sort of low infectious disease, strong infrastructure for chronic disease management, higher lifetime SES on average. So given these two contexts, can we find the signal that, in all of this noise, that there is a clear biological pathway independent of these social differences between these countries? And the answer sort of is yes, that actually, despite all of these substantial differences in SES and in healthcare between these countries, they found that the impact of diabetes on cognitive trajectories was actually quite similar. There was a few differences in domains, but they actually found the mechanisms were working basically the same, and that having higher diabetes high mortality based based on diabetes in Mexico, they attribute to being more about sort of poor management of the disease, but the actual functional mechanism is very similar. So I think that's a really exciting idea of what's here and what's not. They did also note, because as we think about and think systematically about very different societal contexts, that these Mexican older adults had on average 4 years of formal schooling, so that the deficit loss of the cognition probably was more consequential because of this sort of much lower education level. So we need to sort of be careful and tease out what we're looking at in terms of what's universal and what's specific. But this is the kind of ideas we could be playing with and working with as we move forward in this area. And lastly, I'll just mention life course reflexivity, which is a concept that Dale Jennifer published a paper in 2020 in JGSS, which was a revisiting of cumulative disadvantage theory after his 2003 paper that's so widely cited. And one of his sort of extended concepts that he's now working with, and I thought was very creative, is on reflexivity. And I liked Rigney's quote here, so it just sort of adds with it, which is, it is really about all of us, as we may all potentially encounter tipping points that either sweep us either upward or downward into personal and social spirals. And it's the acknowledgement that we are still within a system. This is, that we are working within a system, but a radical change of our placement in that system can have a major impact up or down. And that just reiterates the importance of the system itself. And so what he means by reflexivity is, is that a lot of papers, talk about early life and childhood circumstances, and they'll talk about, and the stratification of those, and they'll talk about these sort of setting in motion cumulative disadvantage processes. And then we go and we look in mid and late life and we see these disparities, and we talk about that even if we haven't measured all these pieces along the way, that having this early advantage or disadvantage sort of starts the process. It's sort of, it's sort of the bullet leaves the gun kind of thing, right? So you're sort of on this trajectory through these sort of structures. But as he argues that this is sort of this is fine, but we need to also not eliminate the possibility, the empirical prospect of independent causal effects in adulthood and later life as well. That it's not necessarily that the disadvantaged childhood becomes the doomed conveyor belt, but to think about sort of all this sort of how it is that we have health influencing input in middle and later life. And I find this to be extremely exciting, because if it's the case that we're getting input, we're actually getting health influencing input all the time, it means that our interventions can happen anytime, that we could still make an impact on health and well-being at any point of intervention, rather than focusing solely on either, fixing children in schools and, and then just seeing what happens. But what if we had interventions and that we could make real difference? And I want to just highlight a brand new paper in Journal of Health and Social Behavior that does show some promising evidence about this. And they were looking at, it's called GRIM age, which is one of the more sensitive biological indices, and they think it's one of the best to approximate biological aging that's being used. GRIM, unfortunately, referring to the Grim Reaper, but so it's an unfortunate name. But interesting, what they found, and they found in their previous work, and they were building upon here, is that the rate of biological aging is actually malleable. We can change the rate of biological aging at different ages of people. That it's not, in fact, this sort of like once you're on this kind of thing, which is actually sort of a lot of the early presumptions about how biological aging worked. And so what they did is they had this, and in fact, they found that if they studied your GRIM age in your late 40s, by the time you end in your GRIM age in your late 50s, your previous decade only explained about half of the variation in biological aging 10 years later. So that's an awful lot of input that's going into your rates of biological aging. And in this particular study, they had a sample of 223 Black women over a period of 11 years. And they measured biological aging at different points, at baseline and a couple times throughout, and then at the end. And in following these women over 11 years, they found that women who experienced declines in financial stability, something sort of went wrong, that they had suddenly reduced income, they had to move in with their adult children, they received new financial support from their adult children, or they experienced new difficulties in housing. So major stressful events in middle age, that they found that those women who experienced those had rapidly, significantly accelerated biological aging, that all of those stressors sped up their biological aging relative to the women who did not have those experiences. So it does show that if we can speed up and slow down biological aging by controlling stressors, then we're in a better place to sort of figure out how we want to, how could we intervene? How could we put in structural buffers in places? I think of things like the eviction moratorium, right? If we could make housing guaranteed and stable, that's one way to reduce stressors that are going to create these sort of rapid accelerations of biological aging and breakdown in bodies. And so thinking structurally about ways to infuse buffers may end up helping us all in the long run figure this out. As I sort of wrap up with this, I want to sort of reiterate, because we've sort of been around and now we're coming back, right? And this idea of where are we as a field? What can we be doing? Where do I think that I think special things are sort of happening and really new, exciting ideas. And I think we need to keep pushing in this inquiry on age and inequality, and finding new ways to integrate inequality as both sort of markers and outcomes and interactive at all levels with what's happening, and really sort of bringing that idea of the structures and systems into life course. So just how that scaffolding creates these sort of spaces of advantage and disadvantages, and the ways in which we may be able to either intervene and change systems of inequality, or that we may be able to, intervene to help out with those. So we're just thinking more dynamically about the whole sort of process. And we can sort of do this in several ways. One is by incorporating structural disadvantage more explicitly into the interrogation of CDA processes. Find elements of structural disadvantage that we can sort of explore as a priori part of the problem, rather than just sort of using it as part of our explanations. The second is comparing the timing and the impact of structural shocks and events on different cohorts. How do these major period events that radically shift and change things impact, inequality and the growth or the shrinkage of that inequality over time, and looking at those across cohorts. And the third would be testing assumptions of what I'm calling normal aging, generalizable statements of we can make about aging by looking across societal cohorts, and in particular, really globalizing that research for aging and looking in other areas and expanding well past the US, England, excuse me, the US Europe connections. And finally, sort of understanding how policies and social structures can shape health in mid and late life, potentially disrupting cumulative disadvantage processes that we're operating. So as I mentioned, with Myrdal and Rigney, and the idea that systems don't want to change. Systems are just fine the way they are. They like their inequality, right? So if we don't have explicit intervention at the level of structure and policy, we'll do little to dismantle those inequality processes. And so figuring out what needs to be done in order to shape midlife, how to take the buckyball, the Buckminster Fullerene apart, how to figure out what needs to happen in order to sort of move through and sort of disrupt a number of these of this inequality as we age. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That's fantastic. So at this point, I can open us up for questions. We are being hosted through the college. And just to kind of mention that Jessica and I cannot see all the participants, but you can either raise your hand and we can try to unmute you, or the other option would be to put your question in the Q&A box and we will see the text there. So Rachel may have to help me with unmuting participants. Okay, I think we are.
Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you. Tyler?
Oh, that's great. Well, Dr. Kelley, thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderfully interesting, and I have so many questions. One question I have is, I was particularly struck at how you were talking about macro level events, having differential effects across, different cohorts of people. I wonder if you could speak more to how that also depends on intergenerational resources as well. For example, the Great Recession that it's quoted affected a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomers, but they're also parents to millennials and Gen Zers as well.
No, I think it's a great question. It's one that I am interested in sort of following the threads through, right? Because if we think of cohorts as not as sort of being their own boxes, we forget that there's really sort of linked lives and this intergenerational transfer of advantage and wealth and all of these processes that that put the Gen Xers and the millennials in a different category because of what their parents were able or not able to sort of do with that. Funaba Addo, I think she's at UNC, has some really interesting work where she's looking at cohort differences in student loan debt in particular, and was finding that that millennials in particular had much more debt, student loan debt, primarily because the students of color had much more sort of student loan debt, primarily because the parents could not sort of help in the same way. So I think there's sort of this idea of understanding how inequality gets transferred to these next generations, which then sets people up into those sort of strata in what they're doing. So and millennials, the joke is the millennials moved home during the recession, right? So there were sort of a drain in sort of those sort of proximate resources as well, which I don't think anybody's even really looking at as what the costs were to supporting family members of other generations through the crisis, and not just sort of their own accumulation with what they're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I think we have a question from Dr. Neil Charnas.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Yeah. Okay, good. That was a really interesting presentation. Of course, I don't really work in this area, but I'm fascinated at some of the findings. One of the things I'm interested in is variability, not just kind of at the inter-individual difference or say cohort level, but also the level of flexibility or resilience at the intra-individual level. In other words, how much people could change or would change if social policy suddenly changed in a particular direction. I'm particularly interested in that, and I'll use the term cohorts of sort of the same age or stage of development. In other words, if you're in a disadvantaged cohort going along the normal trajectory and policy changes, are you going to be able to take advantage of those, say, positive policy changes better at a younger age than later? You might be at the same level, SES-wise, or something of that sort. But in other words, are there kind of independent age moderation effects on intervention impacts for different cohorts?
That's a really interesting question. I've done a little bit of research on intra-individual variability. Is sort of the idea of how much do we vary around our own sort of trajectories of change, and are there any sort of social predictors of that? And as you're mentioning, those who are most disadvantaged are the most variable, within person variable over time, that they themselves are very that they don't have sort of either the resources or the physical, the financial, the whole sort of psychological resources to remain more stable in their mental and their physical health. And that's another marker of disadvantage, is that even if we're all changing, they're much more all over the place. And so I would suggest, to your point, that they're in no position, that those who are the most disadvantaged are in the lowest position to take on major social change. As you say, that even health positive change would require a certain degree of you're using the word resilience, but sort of this idea of sort of the energy to sort of make these major changes, and there just may not be the resources to do that. And really sort of at any age. And I think also about sort of younger adults in the lower strata, who have a lot of financial strain, housing insecurity, transportation insecurity, these sorts of things that they often show very little success rate when even in structural interventions, because they just have so little to sort of draw from to take advantage of things that could be available to them. So it's a good question. I like the idea of maybe reframing that idea of stability and ability to uptake positive change also being another marker of privilege or disadvantage, that those who are disadvantaged say, that looks great, but that's never going to be in my life. And that very much, well, could be that they couldn't take it up or even recognize it if they do it if they recognize it, or even realize that it's available, given the other struggles that they have with that.
Thanks.
I do see one more question in the Q&A. Tyler, to build on Dr. Charnas's question, is resilience to previous disadvantages a privilege because it can depend on stratified resources?
Tyler, could you just elaborate a little bit when you say that because it depends on stratified resources? Just tell me sort of, for instance, what you're thinking.
Yeah, sure. And so to clarify, inter-individual variability over time, does that also depend on the social resources people have access to? And so when we talk about early life not being one's destiny, for example, might that also be a privilege because the very social resources needed to kind of escape those disadvantaged pasts are also unequally distributed?
Yeah, I think if I mentioned you're correctly, I think it's the idea of when we intervene, and I think of efforts to do things like uh, kids in more disadvantaged neighborhoods getting scholarships to prestigious high schools. The idea of disrupting systems, right? That the disadvantage that they were sort of reshuffled in the system, and what those sort of can do. And I think there is sort of this piece of being able to build upon previous disadvantage could and then become sort of an asset and a resource to you. But you're also sort of, always sort of thinking through your context, as well, right? The idea that you're building on your cultural capital and your advantages and your disadvantages. And so in some ways you can sort of overcome some, but you may never have the full resources to sort of fully sort of figure out sort of where you're headed with that, if that's making any sense. Because I think in many ways, that's part of that reflexivity idea, right? Is that we can change, we can sort of change and modify based on our previous experiences. So we're not on a conveyor belt, but the degree to which we could make those changes, as we were just talking about, or the degree to which, we recognize where those pathways may be, could definitely vary by strata and what you have available to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Jessica, I see one more question in the Q&A box from Dr. Don Carr about evaluating normal aging processes. You mentioned this example of Mexico and the US. Given that certain groups might experience better than expected outcomes, for example, the observed Hispanic paradox, how might we figure out if there are universal structural systems that work differently or similarly in different contexts? And how do we really evaluate this impact in different contexts and avoid just hand waving instead of testing real differences?
I don't know. I'm leaving that up to all of you. I just said it was a good idea. No, I think, right. I mean, I think that's that kind of really careful work that has to go into it, that we can't just plow in and do a t-test for a difference and call it a day, that we need to sort of think about, what are those inputs, right? And that's going to be vary by outcome. They were very specific with theirs on diabetes and cognition. And I know they've done some work, and I know that, and I know they've also done some work where they've compared US-born Mexican Americans and then Mexican older adults as well, to try to sort of weed out some of that noise, because they didn't do that in this particular paper, to do that. But I think that's sort of, as you say, that sort of careful idea of, sort of the lived experiences of these groups, lifetime healthcare systems, availability of pensions, but then also doing those in ways that are culturally relevant, right? And that's one of the biggest problems with the comparative work is finding things that are equivalent enough between two societies that you could make a meaningful comparison and say something meaningful about it. And that's a real challenge. And I know that a lot of folks are trying to work on that. And in so doing, sometimes the inquiries get sacrificed a little bit because you didn't get to use all the measures you wanted, or you didn't get to really dig into it because you couldn't get these things to sort of, these apples and oranges to sort of measure up. And so it becomes this sort of unexplained variance between them. And I don't mean to just be dismissive about, but I call it hand waving, but this idea that we don't, it's that we need to be honest with ourselves about what we can and can't do, but also extremely careful in setting those up so that we don't end up making false comparisons, which could end up doing more damage than good in that area.
Thanks so much. I actually might follow up briefly on Dawn's point. I think one of the things that struck me and has before a little bit about is thinking about all of these structural systems. We talk about structural racism, structural sexism, and other processes, but I think often, and maybe you'll agree with me and maybe you won't, that it's both very challenging and then also I think really important to think about age-related policies in these different contexts, right? Comparative, either maybe by nation or by region of the world or even by state. And yet I feel like that is missing from from the dialogue. And I guess I was just curious about whether you would agree with that, whether you've seen anything innovative lately, just because old age, when we think of like the old age pension systems as part of the welfare state, they're so different across so many of these contexts. And I was able to do a little international work, and it just struck me that I thought I knew how different they were. And yet all the different little ways that they play out are just so nuanced. And so I was curious about maybe if you feel like there's an absence of that in the literature, or maybe if there are people that are doing these amazing things that I haven't seen or we haven't seen yet.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, there is some really good work, but I'd have to say it's not comparative. I think what people have done so far, I would see where we've gone with that, because to your exact point, is that people will study the context in Chile, and they'll explain how the pension system works there, and how, you know, transfers happen there. So, and then from there, they then say, well, so, you know, this is what the outcome looks like given this kind of context. And so there's a lot of single country work that I think has done really well with sort of explaining, you know, one by one these differences in these systems. But to your point, I think there's no, you know, I've seen more valiant efforts try to tease apart differences in Europe based on the welfare regimes, but I'm not yet seeing a lot of that comparative work in other global regions. I am seeing it in single country studies where they're explaining their context, but not yet. I haven't seen that. So that's it sounds like your next line of inquiry, and maybe your next R01.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I have my marching orders, but I think, and maybe this does go back to data availability. I mean, the share is this big powerhouse across Europe. And it might be that some of those if you want to think of them as case studies in other places, that they might be just using one data source. So like you said, it seems as though we're getting more and more that's coming online. And that we might be that might be something that's out there for any of us to write an R01 on in the future.
It's all true. And I'm sure most of you know already that the Gateway to Global Aging that USC hosts, that's their, they house there a lot of efforts to do a lot of harmonizing of these big studies. And if you start digging in the technical stuff, you know, that's the first question, right? What can you do with these data, and what can't you do with these data? Your question was this big. What you could test was this big by the time you got to it. So I think people are working hard on it, both conceptually and methodologically. But it's still very nascent, and I think there's a lot of room to grow in this area.
Wonderful. Well, we're almost out of time, but I think we have one more quick question before we go. Maybe just a quick follow-up.
Well, I wish I could ask any question that was quick. But, you know, something that I was really interested in your talk was how you were talking about, you know, intra-cohort inequalities and how macro level events shape them.
Mm-hmm.
Forgive me, it is not my area, so I'm not sure what kind of information we have on it, but how can we learn more about how those same macro level events affect inequalities across cohorts in terms of resources that are social determinants of health?
When you say where we could find it across, meaning more work that's doing that kind of similar things, or more from a theoretical perspective?
Well, either that, or you know, how can we further advance that research if it's still small?
Yeah, I would say I would actually argue that the data are out there. We have a lot of very large scale studies, you know, the HRS, the PSID, you know, NLSY. We have a lot of these large scale studies that have that are set up for either cohort or comparative work already. And I think in this area, unlike what we were just talking about with the comparative on policies and things like that, I think this area is ripe for people to jump right in. We just need to train our vision to think more creatively about cohorts and period effects. So if the data are already set up in cohorts, all you have to do is ask the right question, right? About what social change may make those cohorts very different. My student who just finished her dissertation was looking at the transition to adulthood using the NLSY, both the 97 and the 79 cohorts, and you know, and sort of showed how higher rates of inequality were in the later cohort, in the early millennials, was really heavily tied to the success of their outcomes in their first job, the quality of their education, timing to first partnership. And so she was showing there was more disarray in the ordering and timing of those events, which she then attributed to a number of policy and social change that had occurred. So that's the kind of thing. I think the data are there. I just think we have to think wildly interesting questions about it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're 1 minute over time. So I just wanted to, I know everyone's going to be silently applauding along with me, but I wanted to thank Dr. Kelley again for this. I feel like I just feel very, very inspired about some innovative work, and also just the kind of the big questions that are out there that are just ready and waiting to be answered. And certainly I feel like there's no one better to be giving us this landscape than you, especially right now. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to let the attendees leave the meeting, and I'm going to ask that our panelists, Dr. Kelley, myself, and also Rachel, just stay on for a little bit so that we can wrap up the recording and wrap up our meeting. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. I think we're wrapping up with attendees. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel, again. I was going to ask you, Jessica, about whether it is okay with you if we were to take the recording and make it available on Pepper's